1 week ago, on January the 8th, how close did the UK come to a blackout? By blackout, I mean traffic lights stopping, trains halting, street lights going dark, the main electricity supply ceasing to be available. Chaos. What we're going to allege during the course of this programme is that the national grid came closer than the regulator has admitted last week to just such a moment. It's highly technical, so I'm going to ask you to come with me on a bit of a steep learning curve over the next hour or so. But in an age where energy is so political and net zero is the big project of this Labour government, it's about time we all got to grips with how the lights are kept on. To talk us through this tricky area, we are joined by Kathryn Porter, an independent energy consultant and the scourge of energy officials for her analysis that does not always come up with what they want to hear. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you.
Start, if we could, with the biggest kind of framing before we get into January the 8th, because a lot of people listening and watching probably don't know much about how our energy is provided. So it's not all stored in a giant battery somewhere in the Highlands. It's produced in live time to meet demand. Tell us about that.
That's right. It's actually quite difficult to store electricity at scale. So almost none of it is stored. We have to generate the electricity we need when we need it in real time. And this is really important because electrical equipment gets quite upset if this balance isn't maintained all the time. There are all sorts of protection systems built into the grid, at substations, at power stations, on power lines and so on, that will actually disconnect themselves if this balance isn't properly met. And so it's essential that that's always met in real time. And so you have two sides to that equation. You've got generation and you've got demand. Historically, generation came from a relatively small number of big power stations. You had coal, you had gas, you had a small number of oil power stations, and you had nuclear. And then the demand was reasonably predictable. It was primarily driven by the weather. When it was colder, demand went up. When it was sunnier, demand went down. And there was some variability, but it was reasonably well understood.
So on the generation side, there are all these different sources of energy.
That's right.
You mentioned coal and nuclear and gas, and there are obviously more on the renewable side. Who is kind of sitting in the middle of all of these sources, saying, okay, we need more from you right now, less from you right now, to match supply? Who's in charge of that?
Yeah, so that would be NESO, the National Energy System Operator. And the way it works in this country is the market balances itself effectively. So through price signals, people will choose to run their power station or not run their power station because they can make money. And normally you make money when there's enough demand that you'll need it.
Right.
And this works pretty well. But the grid itself is complicated. So National Grid runs what we call the transmission system, which is the high voltage grid. And that's like the electricity equivalent of motorways and big A roads. It's the way that you funnel electricity around the country in bulk. But just like you might have traffic jams on the motorway and roadworks here and there, you will have what we call constraints in the electricity grid. And so just because you might have a lot of generation in one part of the country, you might not be able to move that electricity to where the demand is. We have quite an uneven distribution of demand, lots of demand in the southeast, for example, not so much in Scotland. So National Grid, NESO, is responsible for managing that in real time. And so they will be the ones who say, oh, actually, we need a bit more of that power station over there. We need a bit less of this one over here. And there's a mechanism called the balancing mechanism through which they do that. People, generators and suppliers will say, these are the prices at which we're willing to increase generation, reduce generation, and the same with demand. That's how they really make those decisions based on that pricing.
So how does that whole system compare today to how it used to be, let's say, 30 years ago?
So now we have no large oil power stations at all on the grid. And we've just recently closed the last coal power station. We've opened a lot of wind generation, both onshore and offshore. We've got some solar, and we've also opened a lot more, we call them interconnectors. They're basically import-export cables with other countries. So we've had one with France for many decades. Now we've built another couple with France. We have them with Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. And we exchange electricity we import and export with these other countries. The thing that's making the system more complex is that wind and solar depend on the weather. And they depend on the weather at a large scale because you can have whole days when it's not windy or sunny. And one thing that people often forget is that the highest period of demand every day is dinner time. And in the winter, dinner time happens at night. So there's no solar at all during the evening peak in winter. So you have this macro effect that you'll have days when it's not windy or sunny. But then also you have a sort of micro level effect, which is individual gusts of wind or clouds will make a difference to your output moment to moment. And so maintaining that match between generation and demand all the time becomes harder. And then at the other side, demand gets more complicated because people have solar panels on their roof, which they didn't. And that looks like negative demand to the grid. You have people having electric cars. Electrification is going to make quite a big difference to the demand picture. And so that becomes more complicated as well. So the whole picture is a lot more complex than it used to be.
More complex and therefore more vulnerable, perhaps. I mean, this is the crux of what we're talking about today, because this move to renewables that most people understandably just support because, we don't want to be only relying on fossil fuels. It feels better to use wind and solar if that's possible. Actually, the downside of it is that because it's variable, it means that our whole system is more vulnerable to potential pressure points or even blackouts, which is what we're going to talk about today.
And if I can be nerdy for a moment.
Please do.
There's another really big way that renewables are causing fragility to the system. So I don't know if anybody remembers studying physics GCSE, but you have your current and your voltage on the electricity system, and that's alternating current. It varies in a very supposedly regular wave shape. And this wave shape is literally generated by gas and nuclear turbines all rotating at the same speed. They rotate at 3,000 revolutions per minute, so that wave is varying at 50 cycles per second.
So that's how the voltage is created.
Exactly.
In the way that the appliance that you plug into the wall expects it.
Exactly. And we talk about the grid frequency. It's a really important measure within the electricity system. And that's what we mean by this nice wave that's changing at 50 cycles per second. Now, the difficulty is that wind and solar, they don't generate this. They generate direct current in the same way that a battery, if you go and buy a battery for your remote control, that is direct current. So that doesn't vary at all with time. It's just a straight line. So you have to use electronics to change it so that it can fit in with what's happening on the grid. And the trouble is, if you start replacing your gas and nuclear turbines with renewables, you lose the mechanism that creates this nice wave. And gas turbines are big, heavy machines. They resist changes to their speed of rotation. So you want them at 3,000 revolutions per minute so that you get your nice regular wave. If you take away the gas turbines and replace it with renewables, you don't get that. You lose a property called inertia. And that if you don't have that stable wave happening all the time, then that can lead to blackouts. Electrical equipment is so sensitive to that measure. The more that we replace conventional generation with renewables, the less stable the grid becomes.
I'm going to put a chart on the screen for those people who are watching. I'll describe it if you're listening on the podcast, but it's from a forthcoming report you've done. Typical generation mix on a low wind day in winter. And as you can see, basically gas is the big chunk of this. This is through the day. You can see the overall demand kind of evolving throughout the day. It goes up, and then a big peak at dinner time, and it comes down. There's some from these so-called interconnectors. That looks like sub 10%. They're coming in from Norway, from France, etc. Nuclear is providing 10, 15?
Yeah, about 10, yeah.
Biomass provides a little bit. But then suddenly when you look at the gas band, that's 50% plus.
Big, yes.
So the reality is there's a little tiny bit of solar there that anyone who's in the UK at the moment might have a chuckle about, because it's not very often that we see the sun. But somehow on this particular type of day between sort of 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. there's a little tiny bit of solar, but it's not really making a huge amount of difference at the moment. So basically, we're still reliant on gas.
We are.
What we're going to talk about at the end is the government plans to move towards net zero and how that might affect things. But should we take a look at this particular example?
Yes.
What happened last week on January the 8th? Because this is, if you think this was technical already, this is going to become even more technical. It points to exactly the kind of vulnerability we might face in the future. And what is particularly worrying about it is how hard it is to get accurate information about it and how reluctant the authorities seem to be to provide that information. So talk us through your analysis of what happened on that day.
So Wednesday last week was a cold day, and demand ended up being higher both than NESO, the National Energy System Operator, had forecast for the day itself, but also higher than it had forecast for the average cold spell weather in the winter. Every year, NESO produces something called the Winter Outlook, and it tells you how much it thinks the demand will be and how much spare capacity, so the excess of generation over demand it will have. And in October, when it published that for this year, it said, yes, the demand will be lower than it has been and the capacity margin will be higher. So it's all looking really good for this winter. Then we got to January last week, and the demand turned out to be higher than the Winter Outlook had suggested, and also higher than NESO's own short-term forecasts.
So we can say that part with confidence, that NESO's forecasts were wrong.
Correct.
And actual demand exceeded what they were expecting.
This is correct,
Okay,
yes.
that's part one.
The second part was that it was a low wind day. So we measure these things in what we call gigawatts. It doesn't really matter what gigawatts are, but this is like the unit that we use. And so demand that day was, I think, 47 something gigawatts. We had
Which is high.
Which is high, yeah.
For
We
the
had
UK.
2.5 gigawatts of wind. Now, on a good day, we'd probably get 16 or 17. On that day, we had 2.5. Some days we've had as little as like a half itself, 0.5. So it wasn't the worst day, but it was a pretty bad day. Now, the other big impact was that the import cables had much lower availability, either than normal or than NESO had said in its winter outlook. So we only had 5.7 of these gigawatts available in the interconnectors. They'd all nominated, so every day everyone has to tell NESO what they're going to do. And the interconnectors were all saying they would be importing to Britain at their maximum availability through the day. So there was no room for NESO to say, oh, please, can we import a little bit more? There was just literally no space. Every possible bit of import that we were able to get, we were getting already, or we were planning to get already.
So at 12:01 p.m. on that day, NESO, the National Energy System Operator, issued what's called a capacity market notice.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So that's actually an automatic trigger warning to say that they've identified, or that the system has calculated, that there's only 500 megawatts of spare margin, so more generation than the expected demand.
Right.
So because these are auto-generated, and sometimes they look at slightly out-of-date data, they're not the most reliable measure. And particularly given the demand forecasts can be off by quite a bit. And actually, I have some analysis that shows in the past 4 years, from the day ahead forecast, the demand error could be as high as 4.7 of these gigawatts. So almost double the amount of wind that was blowing last week on the Wednesday.
Could be in a forecast.
Could be a forecast error, yeah. The evening before, they'd issued something called an electricity market notice. That's actually a more serious warning. They're not issued automatically. They're issued when the control room staff identify a potential problem. Normally, any type of these warnings get cancelled well before the actual delivery time, the real-time moment. That electricity market notice did not get cancelled until after the start of the period that it covered.
So an electricity market notice is saying what? It's inviting additional suppliers to help out because we're facing a pinch point, or what's the point of it?
So this is something that's set out within the grid code, which is part of the rule book that drives the way the system works. And so it alerts market participants to the fact that we're no longer in a business as usual mode. We're in a mode where we're expecting some sort of tightness. And so it's alerting power stations that they need to run if they can. They're alerting the local low voltage grids and suppliers that there might be a need for demand control, which is when they actually start disconnecting load. So regions of the country could be disconnected. They notify the market of different types of tools that they might engage because there could be a potential blackout otherwise.
Later that day, a third kind of notification of some kind was issued. There's a company called Elexon, which is involved in managing the energy and electricity market. They issued something called a loss of load probability, a LOLP. This is now getting really in the weeds, but I think we kind of need to understand this because this has now become the topic of controversy, which people are disputing. What is a LOLP?
Right, so loss of load literally means disconnections. So local or national level blackouts. So Elexon doesn't issue these as notices. This is a continuous calculation that you can look at all the time.
On this occasion, it was 29% risk over 4 hours.
That was the highest that it reached. And again, it's very unusual to see a loss of load probability that's not zero. It's even more unusual to see a loss of load probability that is still not zero once you get to the period it's talking about. And that, on the 8th of January, it never went to zero. So as we went through the evening peak, the system and Elexon data, Elexon gets its data from NESO, by the way, it's not producing it independently. That was showing all the time that there was a non-zero loss of load probability. So official data say that there was a 29% chance that there would have been at least some people being disconnected.
My friend Tom Whipple, who is the science editor at The Times, covered this in The Times of London. The first sentence of his article, "The energy operator is adamant. Contrary to some interpretations of the raw data," I think he's referring to yours, "we were never close to a blackout on Wednesday." Sounds very definitive. And he goes on, because he's been in conversation with NESO, who have been answering his questions, to assert that it's a misconception to think that a 29% risk LOLP is a warning that the buffer will run out, because what they are saying in response is actually there is an additional buffer that they haven't described and they don't publish all the data of in the publicly available dashboards. But what the energy operator is saying in response to these journalists is everyone was panicking, or you were leading a panic about January the 8th, but actually we had a whole additional supply of electricity that had we hit rock bottom, we would have called upon. Our own investigations editor, David Rose, was in touch with them saying, where is the evidence of this additional supply? Can you please detail it for us? And they refused to do that. In fact, they gave him a quote, and I'm going to put it on the screen here, saying, "As an operator for the whole of Britain, we don't talk about individual units because we have lots of customers and technologies, and we don't set out a list of assets that could cover a particular loss." So that's their way of saying, sorry, we're not going to do this for you. What have you discovered now, and what do we think the truth is about the extent of that buffer and how close we came to a blackout last Wednesday?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is that NESO has a duty of transparency. So refusing to provide these data flies in the face of that duty of transparency. It's also not the case that they don't provide unit level information. They provide masses of unit level information through the Elexon website. So I can go up and look up and anybody can. This is fully public information. You can go onto the Elexon website and look up any power station and find out what it was intending to do that day, what it actually did do that day, if it changed what it did because of instructions from National Grid, how much it got paid to make those changes. So there's a huge amount of unit level information that's made available. So I very much question why this particular information, which is extremely crucial, is suddenly being withheld from the market for what appears to be a rather inconsistent reason when you look at their normal practice.
But their assertion is that these cables coming in from Norway provide an additional 1.4.
Yes, well, this is true, but this is what we were expecting to receive. The interconnector with Norway was importing at full capacity the whole day. This wasn't some extra reserve that they could call on. It was already running. Now, the interconnector with Denmark, which is also 1,400 megawatts, that was expecting to run at half capacity because of a maintenance outage. They were persuaded, they were requested, and I think the Danes have actually put this in the public domain that they were asked this, to bring their interconnector back early, and so they did. Without that additional 700 megawatts from the Danish interconnector, we would not have been able to meet demand that day.
So let me just ask you to repeat that. You're alleging here that contrary to the official statements of our energy regulator,
yes,
we came actually really quite close last Wednesday because we were reliant on additional capacity that we actually had to request.
It is a request as well, because NISO cannot compel imports. So people talk about emergency instructions on the interconnectors. They can only emergency instruct to prevent an export. They cannot instruct an import.
They can't say to the Danes, you're going to provide this, because the Danes might say, sorry, we're sending it to Holland right now and you can't get it.
Or we're keeping it for ourselves.
Right.
You can try and buy it if you're willing to pay more than the other people, but you can't compel it. What they're talking about when they talk about this spare cushion is what we call reserve. So they're supposed to have a margin over demand, and then they're supposed to have this reserve. And the purpose of the reserve is to replace the biggest generation or import source that comes into the grid. So when I was talking before about this importance of matching generation and demand all the time, if you lose a big piece of generation or imports suddenly, then you disrupt that nice grid frequency I was talking about, and that can lead to blackouts. It's what happened in the summer of 2019. There was a lightning strike, it took out 2 big power stations, and we had widespread blackouts that covered about 40% of the country. Luckily, it was in the summer, so it didn't have such a critical impact. A similar event in winter could very easily lead to fatalities. So the idea is they have this reserve that can be activated quickly. Now, it should be very easy to identify which units, which power stations or batteries can provide that, because they have to be instructed quickly. You can't have like hundreds of little things, bits and pieces that you would make it up from. It has to be a few big assets to be able to do that.
Just to try and restate this in kind of layman's terms, there's the input, there's the electricity we're getting from all of these different sources, and the rules are that there is supposed to be a margin of error almost. They're supposed to have a backup plan if the largest single energy input falls over. If it trips, if it's a large power station, or if it refuses to supply, if it's an
interconnector can trip as well.
From a different country. So part of our kind of internal rules is they're supposed to supply in their extra margin, hidden in their pocket, more than the single largest input electricity.
And so the hidden in the pocket bit is the interesting bit here, because on the 8th of January, prices in the market went really high. You could make a lot of money running your power stations. So Rye House was being run at a price of £5,500 a megawatt hour. Now, your normal winter price is about £120 to £150. So they were getting £5,500. They made more than £2 million for just a couple of hours of running, and only at half the station capacity as well. They made huge amounts of money. So my question to National Grid is, who was providing this reserve? Who decided that they weren't going to bother making all these millions that they could have been making by running that day? They'd just sit on the sidelines just in case. And if they had decided to do that, how much did they pay them to do that? Because nobody's going to do that for free. So if you could make £2 million for running for a couple of hours in the afternoon, why would you not do that?
Why were they not already doing that?
Exactly. So my question is, which were these assets that were not taking advantage of these high market prices and already running? And if they're already running, then they're not hidden in your pocket.
And specifically, there's a standard, isn't there? There's a security standard, which is SQSS, which is basically, the rule book says there has to be this security standard. You think, and you are alleging, that actually on January the 8th, that standard was breached.
Correct. Yes, I'm alleging that. And I would love to be corrected. If NESO can actually demonstrate which assets were held in reserve, then our minds could be put at rest. But it's not good enough to assert it. They need to demonstrate it.
So, NESO, if you're watching, please come on our next episode. We'd very happily hear from you, and you can detail exactly why we're wrong. Let's zoom out a bit from this specific example. If you're still with us, audience, I can well understand that you may have found that too technical. But here's where the kind of politics and the import of it become real. Because you mentioned just there what might happen in a blackout. Let's just spend another moment on that. Obviously, if it happens in the summer and everyone's out and there's no heating crises, it's not so dangerous. But if it does happen on a day like January the 8th, what are the risks? Hospitals, I presume, have their own generators, so they're not going to suddenly go dark. But street lights, traffic lights?
Yeah, so, I mean, if you imagine a large city at 5 o'clock on a December's evening or an early January evening, you've got no street lights, no traffic lights, no ambient light from building, none of those, those stupid little bollards in the middle of the road that are normally lit up, they wouldn't be lit up. So you'd have car headlights and you'd have pedestrians with mobile phones. At that time of the day, you've got children coming home from school. So this is a recipe for road traffic accidents. And it's likely that some of those would be fatal. But then you've also got, elderly people at home in the dark. They went up the stairs to go to the bathroom. The lights went out. And if you're old and infirm, that's no joke.
And how long would these power cuts theoretically go on for? I mean, how long did it go on for back in 2019?
In 2019, it was several hours before full power was restored in all parts of the country.
That was storm related, so maybe there was damage involved.
No, there wasn't damage. That was just the time it took to get everyone back up and running. And there were some interesting quirks there because it turned out that trains can't be restarted remotely. So the main impact for the public was actually transport disruption because people with laptops literally had to travel around the country restarting stranded trains so that they could continue on their journeys.
And that only hit the east of England, right?
Yes, and it happened in the afternoon on mid-August evening. So there was no issue with darkness, there was no issue with the cold, and so it was an inconvenience for most part. It wasn't dangerous. And as you say, critical infrastructure like hospitals have backup generation. But the problem is if you have that sort of an event in the winter and you have the dark issue, then it becomes much more dangerous. And it's particularly dangerous when people don't expect it. If if you can be told, right, tomorrow we're going to do rolling blackouts and you're going to have a power cut for 4 hours, then you can prepare. You can get candles and torches and, if you have a wood burning stove or whatever, you'll make sure you've got enough wood available. You can get ready. If you don't know about it, then this is when it becomes really dangerous. And that was the situation we're in on Wednesday last week, the 8th of January. It would have been an unexpected event. The public would not have been prepared for it. And so that risk of fatalities would have been higher.
So do you think on our current trajectory, we will have blackouts in the coming years?
I think as we move towards 2030, the risk elevates. Once you get to March 2027, we're losing 2 of our big remaining nuclear power stations. There's uncertainty over the future of the biomass power stations because their subsidies expire at roughly the same time. You've got gas power stations coming to the end of their lives. Quite a lot of our gas power stations were built in the late 90s and early 2000s with an expected lifetime of 25 to 30 years. Experience tells us that gas power stations don't typically run much longer than that. So we're starting to come to that phase where some of those older assets will start to retire. And that retirement plan is likely to accelerate if people believe the strategy for gas power stations, which is that by 2030, they'll only be producing 5% of average annual demand.
Okay, so now you've kind of started us on this latest topic, which we need to cover, I think, which is net zero.
Yes.
Because all of this is taking place in the context of a newly elected government whose big mission is to fast forward the process we've already started towards increased renewable supply and less gas, with the idea that by 2030, as you say, only 5% of our electricity would be supplied by gas.
But they want to keep the entire 35 gigawatts of existing gas power stations in reserve, which is extremely unlikely to be achievable.
Explain that a little bit more. Why do they need so much gas in reserve if in this new future we're going towards it's going to be all based on renewables? Is that because on days like January the 8th, if you don't have any wind, suddenly you need to fire up the
Exactly. If you don't have any wind, what are you going to do? So people say batteries, but the trouble is the batteries that we have at the moment, they run out in an average of 1.5 hours. We have low wind conditions that last for days. So chemical batteries won't do this. The amount of batteries you'd have to build to back up wind. Somebody actually calculated this a few years ago, and I think they worked out that you'd need more land than we have available in the UK for these batteries to be able to fully back up wind. So it's just completely unfeasible with the existing technology.
So what you just said is also, I suspect, news to quite a lot of people. So the move to renewables doesn't mean that you get rid of the old gas-fired power stations. It means that a lot of them remain, for example, for low wind, low sun days. Yes. You need to go back to the old shadow power grid.
Yeah, no, but this is the thing. We have this thing called the capacity market that was invented to make sure that we had stuff to run when it's not windy. So when people say, oh, our bills have been going up a lot, and if you look at the data, you can see that bills were going up since 2004. They went up a lot, obviously, late 2021 and 2022 when you had the impact of the end of COVID and then the Ukraine war. But the reality is that bills have been going up very consistently for the previous 15 years at a time when gas prices had not been going up. Gas prices were stable. And the reason for this is because of the energy transition. So you subsidize your wind power stations and your solar, but then because you have the situation that it's not always windy, you then have to build at least the same amount of capacity of something else, whether that's gas or nuclear or import cables. You have to have that around. So you either have to build new ones or make sure the existing ones stay open.
So it sounds very wasteful.
It's extremely wasteful because you have to double count, basically. You have to double up on everything. And then you also have additional infrastructure that you have to build. So one of the problems with the current plan, and NESO has said this in their report on the Clean Power 2030 strategy, is that you will have to build twice as much grid infrastructure, so power lines, substations and so on, in the next 5 years that we built in the previous 10 years. And that is extremely unlikely to happen because, first of all, supply chains, the planning process is really slow. But at the moment, you've got 3-4 year lead times for big transformers. And nobody's going to order a big transformer if they don't have planning permission. So if you don't get planning permission for your power line in the next year, you won't have the kit on site to build your power line by 2030, much less have it operating.
So there's a kind of practical fantasy element of the 2030. There's
and
also a
cost.
There's an economic element. So whatever it is, it makes everything more expensive.
Yes.
There are redundancies, there are vulnerabilities, all of which increases the price of energy, which in turn impacts the economy greatly.
Exactly. We have the highest industrial energy prices. Industrial activity is declining as a result of this. And, we're paying billions of pounds a year in renewable subsidies. We're paying billions of pounds a year for the capacity market. We're paying billions of extra pounds a year to build all the extra power lines. We're paying billions of extra pounds a year to take account of this intermittency, the wind, the clouds and the gusts of wind that are making the generation so variable moment to moment. We're also paying billions of pounds a year because since we haven't built all of the grid infrastructure to allow the generation from the wind farms to reach consumers, and they have a subsidy that they only receive if they're generating, if you tell them to stop generating, they have to get compensation for that. It's called curtailment payments, and those are now billions of pounds a year. So economically, and this all goes straight to bills.
It's an enormously self-harming
program,
economically
self-harming,
at least.
Yes. And the government says, renewables are cheap. Renewables reduce what we call the wholesale price of electricity. But unfortunately, the more renewables you have, the bigger the gap between the wholesale price and the retail price that businesses and households pay. because effectively a lot of the costs of renewables are not paid by the renewable generators, they're paid by consumers.
So the question is, how much of this will actually happen? Because at some point, this big, perhaps noble political idea, which is to hit net zero and fast forward our way on that journey, is going to come into contact with reality, or it's going to come into contact with voter sentiment. And something like a blackout, which we just apparently missed, how nearly is still controversial, would obviously impact how people think about these things. But the economic costs as well. I mean, I was talking to a Labour MP recently for somewhere in Scotland where they have lots of these wind farms, and he admitted that they're incredibly unpopular with voters in his own constituency. So he's got Ed Miliband, his energy secretary, his boss, talking about how he wants to just absolutely ramp up the wind production. But his voters, the people who are going to keep him in office, are like, we don't like these. They don't see the economic benefit to their local area. They feel they're foreign technology from far away that are just being placed there. They're ugly, and they're not convinced that they're very practical.
And also, they take a lot of steel and concrete to build, which is very energy intensive, so their carbon footprint is quite big. And they rely on components that are made using forced labour in China under extremely environmentally adverse conditions. There's a toxic sludge river from the production of rare earth magnets, which are used in wind farms, moving across the Chinese landscape at something like 20 to 25 metres per year towards the Yellow River, which is a major source of drinking water for millions of people. They have huge environmental problems from these activities. The reason that China dominates the rare earth production globally is because it's the only country willing to do these extremely polluting processes because they are just that dirty and horrible.
So do you think it will actually happen?
I think what's interesting, and without wanting to get too party political about it, towards the end of their time in office, the Conservatives started to ask some pretty probing questions of their officials around the costs of energy and costs of different sources of electricity generation. It was just discovered, I don't know that there was an announcement, I think there was a response to a question where DESNZ has confirmed that work has now been suspended. Now, that's a really bizarre choice to make. Surely we should know what it costs. If we're saying that renewables are cheap, we ought to have the data to back that up. We should be able to say, yes, renewables are cheap by this amount more than gas, for example. The unfortunate reality is that the renewables are not cheaper. The renewables are more expensive. If we want to decarbonise our electricity system, and I think this is where we get a bit of confusion in terms of public support. The public will think, if they're asked, do you want to save the planet? They're going to say yes, because what kind of an evil person says no to that question? But if you start probing more, are you willing to have blackouts to save the planet? Are you willing to pay twice as much for your electricity to save the planet? Are you willing to see thousands of job losses in industry to save the planet?
Well, question mark whether it would save the planet in any case.
Well, yeah, exactly. But, hypothetically, if it did save the planet, would you still be supportive? Then they get a lot less keen. And we saw that with the Uxbridge by-election, for example, that support for net zero policies is by no means uniform and uniformly positive. The better way to have clean energy is actually to go for nuclear. You don't have these issues of depending on the weather. It'll run all the time. People think it's expensive, but when you actually add up all the costs of making renewables happen, then nuclear is actually quite competitive with that. It's not more expensive than wind.
And just to be clear, you are not a consultant for nuclear.
No, I'm not.
Because quite rightly, our commenters are very perspicacious. They will look you up and say, who have you got on your show? You're not working for nuclear.
I'm not working for any nuclear companies.
The conclusion then to our kind of around the houses discussion actually lands on nuclear. I mean, a lot of people get very excited about these small nuclear reactors. I see a lot of that on social media, people who say, the answer is we should have mini modular nuclear reactors in every town. And there's a certain kind of resilience to that. It sounds good. Is that something we should be excited about?
So people believe that because they say Rolls-Royce was a leader in nuclear submarine technology, which it is, right? And then they think they can just take one of these nuclear reactors that powers nuclear submarines, plonk it on the ground, wire it up to the grid, and you're good to go. Unfortunately, you can't do that because nuclear submarines use fuel that is really highly enriched. Because the point is they need to be at sea for really long periods of time, longer than, years and years potentially. Normally you'd refuel a nuclear power station every 18 months. You might want your nuclear submarine at sea for longer than that. They have this very highly enriched fuel that is simply not licensed for civil use. So you can't take that same technology and plonk it on the ground and plug it in. So Rolls-Royce is being forced to design a whole new reactor from scratch, which is why it's not further along the track.
So you're sceptical about the mini nuclear reactors?
So I'm sceptical about the time frame.
So what you're saying is we need old school, big nuclear reactors.
But luckily for us, there is an answer. And again, I don't work for these people. I have no commercial links with them whatsoever. But KEPCO, the Korea Electric Power Company, has built 8 modern big power stations. It's called the APR 1400. They've built 4 in South Korea and 4 in UAE. They were built on average 8.5 years each, and they came in on time and broadly on budget.
Your solution is put 8 or more big nuclear reactors around the country.
Sign a deal with KEPCO for, let's say, 5 or 6 of these to start with. Pay for the first 2 with public money. Because the other big problem we have is persuading private investors to come in. So we need to stop wasting time with incentive schemes that aren't working. Use public money to pay for the construction, say for the first 2. Refinance after the construction phase, because these things make a ton of money when they're running. The risk is all in the building. So once they're built, sell the government stake to the private sector. You would do that at a profit. You would make money for taxpayers doing that. And you would probably, in that process, demonstrate that your regulatory ducks are all lined up for the delivery of new nuclear. So you'd get private finance in for construction for subsequent projects. This would be the quickest, cheapest, and most efficient way of delivering new nuclear.
And meanwhile, across Europe, they've been turning nuclear power stations off.
Well, in Germany.
In Germany, at least.
Finland,
France is still very
France
much
is building new ones. Finland has just opened a new one. Spain is thinking of closing its ones, but Spain and Germany are the outliers here. Poland is looking at building new, and they're talking to KEPCO, the Koreans. There's a lot of interest in new nuclear in Europe, and even more in the US. It's really interesting in the US that 2 closed down nuclear power stations are in the process of reopening. You've got Holtec trying to open Palisades, and this was the first one that made the application. The regulators are there scratching their heads saying nobody's ever asked us to do this before, so we don't have, our computer isn't saying yes or no because nobody's asked the question. Even more interestingly, Constellation wants to open 3 Mile Island, Unit 1.
Where's 3 Mile Island?
Well, 3 Mile Island, which had the incident. One of the units there, had a meltdown, so they had to close it.
When was that?
In the 70s, I think it was. There was no release of radiation, but it was one of the controversies around nuclear. And it's also coincided with a period of time where people were still quite concerned about nuclear war. And there'd been sort of publicity campaigns about what to do if a nuclear bomb drops on you. So there was a lot more adverse public sentiment about nuclear. But now they're talking about reopening the unaffected reactor at that site, which is quite significant, really. You've got big tech companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google signing power purchase agreements with nuclear generators for both existing plants and potential future projects to supply all their data centers, and particularly with the growth in electricity demand expected from AI. So, by not being gangbusters on new nuclear, we're a bit behind the curve.
Sum up for us, Kathryn, how you see it here in the UK with the political situation as it is and this net zero mission of the government. How perilous is the situation we're in, do you think?
I was surprised that we got so close this winter. And it's obviously potential that we could see that situation again because we're just over halfway through the winter. My expectation has always been that as we come towards the end of this decade, we start to see real risks crystallising around a potential for blackouts if we continue along the current trajectory. Now, with the acceleration towards 2030, those risks grow. My fear is that the government is not asking the right questions. It's not asking the questions of NESO around how stable is this grid? How much spare margin do we have? Tell us about your forecasting errors. Because these data are not published. It's not even clear that NESO tracks it itself. And if it's getting its forecasts wrong, then the consequences of that on a tight day could be catastrophic. So the government is not asking the right questions around security of supply, and it's not asking the right questions around cost. And the questions it is asking about security of supply and cost are the wrong ones, because it's landed on gas as being the worry. We had 20 years of low, stable gas prices. I bet if you calculated the cost of electricity since 2000, if you just stuck with gas versus what we have now, even with the high prices because of Ukraine, I bet you'd find that overall we would have spent less on electricity over the past 25 years.
It's all giving me weirdly sort of traumatic memories of the COVID era, actually, where you had these bureaucrats and quangos officially giving forecasts and providing the government with quite speculative information, and the government just hoovered it up very uncritically. You know, I don't know if you see a parallel there.
One of the big troubles is that there are too few people in Whitehall and Westminster with hard science backgrounds. If your educational background is in history and politics, you're not asking the hard questions, and you're not asking the hard questions about the numbers, because adding up numbers isn't your strong suit. And we really need more scientists informing these policy decisions, because a lot of people with science backgrounds were looking at COVID, scratching their heads saying, how can people possibly think this is a good idea?
Kathryn, thank you so much for coming in.
You're very welcome.
That was Kathryn Porter, the independent energy consultant, talking us through kind of the detail and the nitty-gritty. I hope you followed all of it. But as we discussed there, this is the new topic that we all need to become more expert on, because if net zero is really going to be the priority and we are hurtling towards all of these goals, we need to know how vulnerable our power supply might become, and of course, how expensive. Thank you to Kathryn. Thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.